You're here. Thank you for being here to celebrate the new year with Trailhead and to celebrate what God is doing here in Wellington. We're excited to see what He's going to continue to do in this place over the coming days. You know, this is like every New Year. It's a time where we come and we start to talk about, start to think about things that we did maybe in 2018 that we don't want to keep doing, things that we did in 2018 that we want to do better or grow in, those kind of things. And so this is the time of year where we come together and make resolutions, that type of stuff. And honestly, that last song that we sang is perfect for this time of year. I don't know if you thought about this while we were singing, but really through the cross, Jesus gave us two gifts. He gave us, first of all, the gift of taking away our mess, right? Taking away our sin. And second of all, the second gift that He gave us was He gave us the gift of His goodness. So He takes away our sin and our mistakes, everything wrong that we do, and He gives us His righteousness, His goodness, as His covering. I don't know of any better way to start over than that, right? And so that's a perfect song, perfect way to begin 2019. And we are talking a little bit about resolutions, talking about changing things in our lives and in our world as we get going in 2019. And so let me just ask you, how many of you guys would actually admit to being people who make resolutions? Anybody sit down and write down resolutions? One or two? All right, good deal. There were 0 in the last service, so I don't know. I mean, we've had like 10 total in our services, so I'm impressed with you guys that sit down and do it. I'm not going to make you tell us if you have already broken any of those resolutions, because I know how I do with that kind of stuff, right? You do pretty well for a few days and then end up doing things that you thought you wouldn't do and all of that. But we make resolutions. This is a time of the year where we say, you know what, I want to be a better parent. I want to do a better job of leading our family. I want to do a better job as a husband. And so we write down things like, as a husband, this year I'm going to take my wife on a date every single week. You know, for 52 weeks, right? This is not a promise, this is an illustration. Okay? And then we, wives say things like, you know what, it may just be one word, it may just be one sentence, but I'm going to encourage my husband. I want to build him up. And so every day, for the next 365 days, I'm going to say something encouraging to him to build him up, right? And so we set these resolutions out there. Maybe it's a weight loss thing, maybe it's a going to the gym thing. I don't know what it is, but we all have these. Maybe it's reading through the Bible. Here's my question to you. Have you ever heard somebody set a resolution that was just absolutely over the top? That you kind of looked at it and thought, yeah, good luck with that, buddy. Like, this year I'm going to end homelessness in the world. Well, we'll give you the golf clap and we'll watch as you try to make that happen, right? But there's a sense as we start the new year that we want to set goals, but we also want to be realistic about those goals. And the truth is, if we're just honest, I'm not trying to be a pessimist, I'm just trying to be honest, we're not going to change the world, right? You're not going to end all the wars that happen in the world this year, you and you alone. You're not going to take the content of the internet, which some of it you love, some of it you hate, some of it you really disagree with. You're not going to take all the content of the internet and change it to make it fit what God would want it to be. It's just not going to happen this year by your power, your strength, my power, my strength, right? So the reality is we probably can't change the world. But here's the other truth in that. While we can't change the world, we can change our world. We have the ability to do that as we're working with God and God is working in us. We may not be able to change everything in the world, but we can change what's happening in our lives and in our circles of influence. We can change our world. And so that's what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. Making statements that Jesus made from the book of Matthew, where He talks to us about ways that we can change our lives for the better, where we can actually change our world. So if you follow us on Facebook, if you get our email newsletter, you may have seen earlier this week that we are reading through the book of Matthew to start the year. And if you've never been at Trailhead when we do this, we'll pick a book of the Bible occasionally, and we will just very simply read one chapter a day, going through the book, and then at the end of the week we'll come together and we'll talk about something from those 7 chapters that we've read in here. So that's what we're doing with the book of Matthew. If you started reading with us this week, you may have noticed there are a few themes that rise to the surface over and over again. There's one thing that's mentioned, one topic that comes up twice. In these 7 verses, it comes up twice, and it's directly related to how we can change our world, how we can start to live the life that God created us to live and walk in that every day. And the way it's told is the first time it comes up is it's told in story form. And it's represented in the life of Jesus, actually. So there's this point, if you're familiar with Jesus, you may know that for the first 30 years or so of his life, he basically lived in anonymity. He wasn't known. It wasn't like he was all that much different from anybody else. In fact, his Hebrew name is Joshua. That's what he would have been called in a lot of circles. He was probably one of 5 Joshuas in his area. He went to school with all the other kids. He had a carpenter, and so he learned that trade. And he was a pretty normal kid. He lived a fairly obscure, behind the scenes kind of life for about 30 years. And then something happens in the middle, and then all of a sudden, the last 3 years of his life are a public ministry where everything is different, it seems, than it was at the beginning. But there was something that happened in the middle that Matthew tells us about. And it was this thing in the middle that really, I think, was kind of the jumping off point, the starting point for changing the way that the world was experiencing Jesus. So if you read with us, you may remember Matthew chapter 3. At the end of chapter 3, it tells us that Jesus was starting to call some disciples to himself. He went out to the Jordan River where his cousin, a guy named John the Baptist, was hanging out. And John the Baptist was baptizing people. And so Jesus comes and he's baptized. And do you remember what happens when Jesus comes back up out of the water? It says, Scripture says, that a dove comes down from heaven, and then a voice speaks from heaven. God speaks out loud, right? And he says, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." If you thought Jesus was ordinary to that point, which probably everybody kind of did, that's one of those moments, if God speaks out loud, I don't know if God's ever spoken out loud to you. He's never spoken out loud to me, right? But if God speaks out loud to you, that's one of, I think I need to write this down, right? I need a new pair of underoos at the same time. But I need to write this down because this is a memorable moment. Something's happening here, right? This is a big deal. And so it's kind of a public announcement that things are changing in the way that Jesus is going. And right after that, in Matthew chapter 4, it tells us that Jesus goes out, he's led by the Spirit out into the wilderness. And I don't know what you picture in your mind when you think of the wilderness. I grew up in the South, and so there are tons of trees. And I think wilderness, I think like you go into the forest kind of thing. Maybe like somebody going hunting or whatever. If you go to Israel, you will not find that kind of wilderness. That's not what it's talking about. So just to give you the right mental image, it's talking basically about the desert. He goes out to a place where there's nothing. There are pretty much no trees. The Spirit takes him out there. There's no food. And for 40 days, do you remember what Jesus does? He fasts. He doesn't eat. He spends time connecting with the Father, but he doesn't eat. As a result of this time, he springboards into a public ministry that is a ministry that is just absolutely covered by the things of God. And he goes from this obscurity and anonymity to this place where everybody wants to be around him, everybody wants to see what's happening in his life, and it kind of all centered around what happened at that one little point of 40 days where he goes out and spends time in the wilderness. And there's a lot going on in that passage. I wish we had more time to talk through it, but if you, just to give you a quick synopsis, if you remember the story, you remember the story of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt? When they came out of Egypt, they came out and they went into the wilderness, right? And they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and after 40 years, well, during the 40 years, they struggled with a few things. One of the things they really struggled with was there was a period where they said, we don't have food. You know, where is our food going to come from? And they struggled with that, and they struggled with trials and temptations, and many times in those trials, they totally blew it. They failed the temptation, they failed the trial, whatever it was. You fast forward to the life of Jesus, and now Jesus, kind of in a parallel way, is taken into the wilderness. And for 40 days, he has no food. And at the end of the 40 days, he goes through these trials and temptations and these hardships. But the difference is, this time Jesus passes the test. Where these guys did not pass the test, Jesus actually passes the test. And so there's this incredible stuff that's going on in this passage. But what I want you to see is that it's there to show us a few things. One of the key things it's there to show us is that fasting made a huge difference in the life of Jesus. I told you we're going to look at ways that Jesus says we can change our worlds. Let me just give you fair warning. You probably already figured this out. The things that Jesus says are not going to be typical, these are the things we put on our New Year's resolutions type things. In fact, these are probably going to be things that you look at and you say, I don't really like that idea. I like some ideas from him, but this doesn't sound like what I really want to do. I'm not excited about this, okay? But what we're going to see today is that twice in these 7 verses, this idea comes up that if you really want to see change in your life, if you want to start to change your world, maybe you should take this idea of fasting seriously. And so Jesus experiences that up front. And then after that, we go forward into Matthew chapter 6. And that's the point where, if you're reading with us, you may remember this is kind of right in the middle of what's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's this kind of long dialogue that Jesus gives. It's chapters 5 through 7 is this speech, essentially, that Jesus gives. And at the beginning of chapter 6, Jesus gives us 3 ways that we can strengthen our faith, that we can grow in our faith, that we can get stronger in our relationship with God. And so the first thing that he says is basically, if you want to continue to grow, if you want to continue to get stronger in your relationship with God, you need to be generous as God is generous. And he talks about giving to the poor and not letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And you may remember some of that if you've been reading with us. So we would look at that, and I think most of us could agree with that and say, yeah, I get that. God has been incredibly generous to me. If I'm going to imitate him, I need to be generous. I need to care about those who are hurting and hardship and going through all that kind of stuff as well. And so he walks us through that. And the second thing he says is, if you want to continue to really get strong in your faith, you need to spend time really working on this area of prayer. And again, I think all of us in here would probably say, okay, right, that's the Sunday school answer. We can check that one off. We know that one. Yeah, we need to spend time in prayer. And then the third thing that he says is, if you really want to grow in your faith, you need to consider this thing called fasting. And for us in the American church, this is a thing that we just don't talk about a whole lot. We tend to just kind of skirt over this or move past it because it's not comfortable, to tell you the truth. I mean, honestly, if you look at those 3 things, you take the generosity thing, and we get that. We kind of say, okay, I don't want, stuff to rule my life. And so I'm willing to part with some of my treasure if that's going to help me grow in God. And then we look at the prayer thing and we say, okay, I get that, I understand. I'm willing to part with some of my time to spend time in prayer in order to grow in God. And then we look at the fasting and we say, part with my food. Wait a minute, now that's messing. That's kind of getting in my life in a way I don't want you to get in my life, God, right? I'm okay letting go of some treasure. I'm okay letting go of some time. But food is that's central to everything in our lives. And it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know about this. This may be this is for the super Christians that are on the extreme level up here, right? Not just the normal everyday Christians. But Jesus says, I want you to pay attention to this. So let's just walk through what he says in Matthew chapter 6 and see why this is important. So Matthew chapter 6, I want to look at just the first few words of verse 16. It says this, when you fast, and I know this isn't even a sentence yet, but I want to pause for a second to just focus on a couple of these words. So it says, when you fast. Jesus doesn't say, if you feel like it's a good idea. He doesn't say, when you're not eating because you've got a stomach virus or something like that. He says, when you fast. When you practice this type of connecting with God, and almost like this is a natural way of connecting to God, right? And let's just put it where it should be. Fasting is voluntary. God's not going to come to you and say, I'm going to have nothing to do with you if you don't fast. He doesn't say that. Just like he doesn't say, I'm not going to have anything to do with you if you're not generous, right? It's a voluntary thing, but if we want to grow spiritually, it's an assumed thing that we will do. Jesus says, when you do this, when you fast, and he'll tell us what should happen as a result of that. But the second word I want us to just kind of unpack for a second is the word fast itself. Because I bet if I were to just ask you the question, what is fasting? I bet if I were to have you write that out, we would have a lot of similar answers, but there would be differences as well, right? Because there are some people that would say fasting, yeah, that's just going without food. If you ask your doctor, and you have a medical doctor that tells you you need to fast for the next 24 hours, you really don't even have to ask, right? You know what he's talking about. He's not talking about abstaining from your favorite TV show. Okay, he's talking about not eating food. And so some people would say fasting is about food. Some people would say, well, no, it's just about abstaining from certain things. Almost like the idea of Lent. If you grew up around the Catholic Church, this is a part of the Catholic Church where for 40 days before Easter, you have Lent where you give up something as a way to point you to God, to help you connect with God. And so they may say, well, fasting could be food, but it could also be technology. Or, it could be a certain hobby that I like or whatever. The reality is, I believe that most of the time, when God calls us to a fast, he's talking about food. And here's why I say that, because he's dealing with us on the basis of needs. We need food. If you don't eat food for a certain period of time, you feel it, right? It doesn't take a whole long time either. You feel it. If you say, I'm going to fast from technology, it changes the course of your day a little bit, but it's not a need. People lived without technology for most of the history of the world. Need. It's just something that we like. It's something that we're used to, but it's not a need, where food is a need. And so let's just address some of the questions that would naturally come up here. The first question may be, is this okay to do? I mean, is it really okay to go without food for a period of time? And by the way, it's not just going without food. That's half of what fasting is. Going without food. The other half is letting that push you to God. So going without food and intentionally seeking God, that's what it's talking about as it talks about fasting. So is this healthy? Is this okay? Am I going to die if I go, without food for a little while? Here are the answers to that. The reality is we tend to think we need 3 solid meals a day. We've been taught that. We've lived that way most of our lives, right? Most of the world does not have 3 meals a day that they eat. And they make it, they survive, right? This is a cultural thing to us. And do we like it? Yeah, absolutely. I'm the first one to advocate for 3 meals a day and a few snacks in between, all that kind of stuff, right? That's the way that we think about life, but that's not necessary. The reality is you start to get hungry, and when you're getting hungry, it's like your stomach is a spoiled child, honestly. It's like your stomach is about 2 years old and it's just spoiled rotten. It's got whatever it wants. And so it's just throwing a fit. I want to have some food right now, but does it need it? No. It doesn't. In fact, there have been studies that have been done, even by like the USNA, that have shown that you can go 21 to 25 days without food where your body is just using its reserves. It's not even doing any damage to itself. over that length of time. You can go almost a month without food. Now, it doesn't work that way with water, right? You can go almost a month without food and have no ill effects on your body at all. In fact, it's kind of a good thing. It's almost like a cleansing thing in some ways. And so you might say, well, I tried one time to skip a meal, and you know what? I got so shaky, and I just couldn't even focus. And you know what that is? That is, you had too much sugar in your coffee, okay? That is a sugar issue. You've been eating too many desserts, drinking too many sodas, putting too much in your coffee, whatever it is. But we are addicted to sugar in our culture here, and that's what that is. You start to feel shaky and feel a little bit weak, you're not going to die. You're just not going to die. You just need sugar. Here's where you should stay away from fasting from food. If you're a diabetic, don't fast from food. If you have cancer and you've been going through chemo, you don't want to fast from food. There are certain things that are very clear. You shouldn't stay away from food. But for most of us, the vast majority of us, this is not a dangerous thing. It's actually a healthy thing. It actually can be a good thing. And what happens in this fast, like we said, is you get hungry. That hunger prompts you to say, I need something. And instead of saying, I need food, you go say, God, I need you. I need you to be my sustenance. I need you to be my provider. I need you to be the one who takes care of my needs, not just food. And so Jesus says, when you fast, and he goes on in this verse and says, when you fast, do not look somber like the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. So what Jesus is saying in this context is he's saying, if you're fasting for the point of pride, in other words, if you're fasting to be able to say to somebody else, you know what, one time I went 3 days and I didn't eat a single thing. If that's the motive in your fasting, you're wasting your time. That's what Jesus is saying. It's not about you. He says this is about your relationship to God. This is supposed to be driving you to God. And everything in fasting is supposed to bring your relationship closer with Him. And so he says this is not about you. But he's doing it in a way that I think is kind of unique because he's connecting two things here. He's connecting the physical with the spiritual. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but most of the time when we come to a church service, when we think about religion or faith, when we think about spirituality, we think about our feelings and we think about our mind, our beliefs, right? We tend to think that's what it's all about, is the way that God makes me feel and the things that I believe based on what He has said. But what God says is, no, there's this incredibly important connection between the physical and the spiritual that fasting helps you bring the two together. Another story that just shows this point dramatically is in the book of Exodus. And I'm sure you guys have read the book of Exodus recently, right? As your part of your New Year's resolution, you've already gotten there, I'm sure. But in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, what happens is the people of Israel, they are wandering in the wilderness. They come out of Egypt, they're wandering. And as they're in the wilderness, they are attacked by another people group. They are attacked by the Amalekites. And as they are attacked by the Amalekites, God comes to Moses, who's leading them at that point, and says, Moses, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go up on this particular hill, stand on the hill, and I want you to raise your hands to me. And what the Bible says is, as long as Moses raised his hands to God, the Israelites would win. And when he put his hands down, because he got tired or whatever, they would start to lose. And you may look at that story and say, that is the most ridiculous story I've ever heard in my life. Why in the world would God do that? But he's making a point about the physical and the spiritual. What he's doing is he's saying, Moses, I want you to lift your hands, showing physically that you are desperate for me to move in this battle. And as long as you keep your hands up, showing physically that you are desperate for me to do something that you can't do, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be fighting on your behalf. But as soon as you put your arms down and the physical and spiritual aren't connected anymore, he says, you're going to start to lose the battle. And again, it sounds weird, but there's this incredible connection. And so you may have seen the old movies. I mean, Moses eventually has to have guys come hold his hands up for him. You know, he can't stand there and do that by itself all day. And so as he keeps his hands raised, as they stay in desperation to God, physically and spiritually, they win the battle. That's exactly what fasting does. Fasting brings us physically to a point where we're standing before God saying we are absolutely desperate. I don't know if you've ever felt serious hunger, but when you really get hungry, you feel desperation, right? And that's what fasting does. It physically brings us to a point where we're saying, I am desperate, God, for you to do something that I can't do on my own. If we go on reading what Jesus said in verse 17, he says, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting. But only your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And if you're anything like me, you read some things in the Bible and you want to know what some of these words mean. You hear God say, I am going to reward you. Well, what does that mean, God? You know, if I start fasting in 2019, if I use this as a way to start changing my world, what does it mean that you're going to reward me? Does that mean you're just going to give me whatever I ask for? You know, that I've got dreams about living in a house that's 1,000 square feet bigger than my house, and if I fast long enough, no, that's not what it means. But what it does mean is occasionally when you fast, prayers that you've been praying that have not been answered, God may answer those prayers. Occasionally it means if you've been praying for provision that you haven't seen for someone or for something, that God answers that prayer. It may mean that he rewards you with something that you're not expecting altogether. But more than that, the thing that it is saying is the reward that always happens. The reward that comes every single time you fast is that when you fast, God says, and I see what you're doing, I see that you're crying out to me, your reward is that you will get more of me. And we may say, you know, that doesn't sound as exciting as winning the lottery, God. I kind of, you know, but God says, I will give you more of me in your world, in your life. I will give you more of my presence. And let me ask you just a quick question. Is it easier for you to change your world, or is it easier for God to change your world? Is it easier for you to set a resolution and actually carry it out and live it out? Or is it easier for God who created you and created your little sphere of influence in your world? Is it easier for you or him to change what's happening? God says, you come to me in desperation, and what I'm going to do is I will give you more of me to make the changes that are most important in your life. I will do what you cannot do. And so if you wrap all of that up and kind of put it in one big idea, I think what all of this is saying, what Jesus is telling us through this passage is he's saying this: fasting shifts our resolutions from I will do to I will plead. Now, just think about that for a second. Most of our resolutions are I will do resolutions, right? This year I will do better at going to the gym. This year I will do more for my family, or I will do this with my health. It's about what I can do. This year I will do what I can do. That's what our typical resolutions are. When we start the year, instead of with those kind of resolutions, with fasting, what it does is it shifts to, God, I desperately need you to do this in my family. God, I desperately need you to do this in my life. And so fasting just shifts the focus from I will do to I will plead with the one who actually can do. You may look at that and say, that all sounds good, but like we mentioned, isn't fasting kind of like the super Christian thing? You read the Bible and Jesus does it, and Moses does it, and Elijah does it for 40 days, and Daniel does it for 21 days, and Peter does it for 3 days, and Paul does it multiple times, and you see this over and over again, and you think, well, that's That's for the super Christians. I'm not so sure. Does it really make a difference in a normal person's life to go without food and to connect with God in this way? And I don't know how to answer this well other than just to tell you a story, give you an illustration. If you were to talk to people who know very much about starting churches, planting churches, and by the way, churches like Trailhead get started all the time in the United States and all over the world. New churches are starting all the time. Hundreds of churches across the U.S. will be started this year. People study those churches on a regular basis. If you were to talk to those people who study churches that are getting started, and you were to mention to them, hey, I go to a church that is not 2 years old yet, but we have about 200 people attending the service, they would say, that is not normal. Does it happen? Yeah, it happens, but that is absolutely not normal. If you were to go to them and you were to say, hey, I go to a church where we are not 2 years old yet, but we actually have a building that we own and it's halfway paid off and we're not 2 years old yet, they would say that is ridiculous. That is absolutely not normal. And so the question is, why are some of these things happening? And some of it can be explained just by social things that are happening. I mean, churches can grow if they want to grow here because people are moving here, right? There are a lot of people coming into the area, so that's part of the explanation there. But you know what I think the biggest part of it is? I really think the biggest explanation of this is that for the last 3 years, God has prompted several leaders at Trailhead to start their year by fasting and coming to Him and saying, God, please do what only you can do. We want to be a part of your mission, but we can't do this on our own. Please do what only you can do. So in 2017, people were fasting. In 2018, people were fasting and praying. 2019, people are fasting and praying even now. And I believe that is a huge reason that we are seeing some of the things that we are seeing at Trailhead Church. Does fasting matter in the life of normal people like us, like you and me? Yeah, it makes a difference. Can it change your world? Absolutely. Because it shifts the focus from I will do to I will plead with God so that He can do. If you want to see change happen, there is no more powerful thing that you can do than invite God into the middle of it and say, you do it, because it's too big for me. So here's what I want you to do. At Trailhead, we try to encourage you not to just come and get good information and then, go about your life and say, okay, that sounded great. I'll probably hear another message on fasting in a couple of years. I don't know. Hopefully, we not only hear this, but we actually start to live it out. And so here's our challenge to you this week. We're going to challenge you to actually fast. Participate in some sort of fast. And does that mean you have to go a full day? Does that mean you have to go a week? No, it doesn't mean any of that. If you've never fasted before, start small. And one thing that you should probably know, if you've never fasted before, you might need a day in advance. So the day before you actually fast, you probably need a day to kind of wean off of some things, start to get off the caffeine, start to get off the sugars. That'll make it a whole lot easier on you. But even if it's just like one meal, pick a meal this week where you say, I am not going to eat that meal. And as I get these hunger pains, as I get these times where I'm being prompted to eat, instead, I'm going to allow that to prompt me to go to God and to plead with Him over the most important thing in my life right now. I'm going to allow those hunger pains to direct me to someone who has so much more power in this than I do. And so that's our challenge to you. Maybe it's not even a full fast. Maybe it's you just cut back on certain things. Maybe for a day all you eat is vegetables. If you love meats and that kind of stuff, maybe you cut back, and that gives you every reason to pray, right? God, I hate vegetables, but I'm just going to eat this today so that I can connect with you, so that I can do it. Whatever it is, however God prompts you, take time this week where you say, I'm putting food as secondary to God. And I'm putting God as the one who I know can shape my world in the way that it's supposed to be shaped. Shift from I will do to I will plead and see what God does to change your world. Let's go ask him to help us.